Chapter 11. The Story of Leslie Moore. "Yes, the 8th baby arrived a fortnight ago," said Miss Cornelia from a rocker before the fire of the little house one chilly October afternoon. "It's a girl. Fred was ranting mad, said he wanted a boy, when the truth is he didn't want it at all. If it had been a boy, he'd have ranted because it wasn't a girl. They had 4 girls and 3 boys before, so I can't see that it made much difference what this one was, but of course he'd have to be cantankerous, just like a man. The baby is real pretty, dressed up in its nice little clothes. It has black eyes and the dearest tiny hands." "I must go and see it. I just love babies," said Anne, smiling to herself over a thought too dear and sacred to be put into words. "I don't say but what they're nice," admitted Miss Cornelia, "but some folks seem to have more than they really need, believe me. My poor cousin Flora up at the Glen had 11, and such a slave as she is. Her husband suicided 3 years ago, just like a man." "What made him do that?" asked Anne, rather shocked. "Couldn't get his way over something, so he jumped into the well. A good riddance. He was a born tyrant, but of course it spoiled the well. Flora could never abide the thought of using it again, poor thing, so she had another dug, and a frightful expense it was, and the water as hard as nails. If he had to drown himself, there was plenty of water in the harbor, wasn't there? I've no patience with a man like that. We've only had 2 suicides in Four Winds in my recollection. The other was Frank West, Leslie Moore's father. By the way, has Leslie ever been over to call on you yet?" "No, but I met her on the shore a few nights ago, and we scraped an acquaintance," said Anne, pricking up her ears. Miss Cornelia nodded. "I'm glad, dearie. I was hoping you'd foregather with her. What do you think of her?" "I thought her very beautiful." "Oh, of course. There was never anybody about Four Winds could touch her for looks. Did you ever see her hair? It reaches to her feet when she lets it down. But I meant, how did you like her?" "I think I could like her very much if she'd let me," said Anne slowly. "But she wouldn't let you. She pushed you off and kept you at arm's length. Poor Leslie. You wouldn't be much surprised if you knew what her life has been. It's been a tragedy," repeated Miss Cornelia emphatically. "I wish you would tell me all about her. That is, if you can do so without betraying any confidence." "Lord, dearie, everybody in Four Winds knows poor Leslie's story. It's no secret. The outside, that is. Nobody knows the inside but Leslie herself, and she doesn't take folks into her confidence. I'm about the best friend she has on earth, I reckon, and she's never uttered a word of complaint to me. Have you ever seen Dick Moore?" "No." "Well, I may as well begin at the beginning and tell you everything straight through so you'll understand it. As I said, Leslie's father was Frank West. He was clever and shiftless, just like a man. Oh, he had heaps of brains, and much good they did him. He started to go to college, and he went for 2 years, and then his health broke down. The Wests were all inclined to be consumptive. So Frank came home and started farming. He married Rose Elliott from over harbor. Rose was reckoned the beauty of Four Winds. Leslie takes her looks from her mother, but she has 10 times the spirit and go that Rose had, and a far better figure. Now, you know, Anne, I always take the ground that us women ought to stand by each other. We've got enough to endure at the hands of the men, the Lord knows, so I hold we hadn't ought to clapper-claw one another, and it isn't often you'll find me running down another woman. But I never had much use for Rose Elliott. She was spoiled to begin with, believe me, and she was nothing but a lazy, selfish, whining creature. Frank was no hand to work, so they were as poor as Job's turkey. Poor! They lived on potatoes and point, believe me. They had 2 children, Leslie and Kenneth. Leslie had her mother's looks and her father's brains, and something she didn't get from either of them. She took after her grandmother West, a splendid old lady. She was the brightest, friendliest, merriest thing when she was a child, Anne. Everybody liked her. She was her father's favorite, and she was awful fond of him. They were chums, as she used to say. She couldn't see any of his faults, and he was a taking sort of man in some ways. Well, when Leslie was 12 years old, the first dreadful thing happened. She worshipped little Kenneth. He was 4 years younger than her, and he was a dear little chap. And he was killed one day, fell off a big load of hay just as it was going into the barn, and the wheel went right over his little body and crushed the life out of it. And mind you, Anne, Leslie saw it. She was looking down from the loft. She gave one screech. The hired man said he never heard such a sound in all his life. He said it would ring in his ears till Gabriel's trump drove it out. But she never screeched or cried again about it. She jumped from the loft onto the load, and from the load to the floor, and caught up the little bleeding, warm, dead body, Anne. They had to tear it from her before she would let it go. They sent for me. I can't talk of it." Miss Cornelia wiped the tears from her kindly brown eyes and sewed in bitter silence for a few minutes. "Well," she resumed, "it was all over. They buried little Kenneth in that graveyard over the harbor, and after a while Leslie went back to her school and her studies. She never mentioned Kenneth's name. I've never heard it cross her lips from that day to this. I reckon that old hurt still aches and burns at times. But she was only a child, and time is real kind to children, Anne dearie. After a while she began to laugh again. She had the prettiest laugh. You don't often hear it now." "I heard it once the other night," said Anne. "It is a beautiful laugh." Frank West began to go down after Kenneth's death. He wasn't strong, and it was a shock to him, because he was real fond of the child, though, as I've said, Leslie was his favorite. He got mopey and melancholy, and couldn't or wouldn't work. And one day, when Leslie was 14 years of age, he hanged himself. And in the parlor, too, mind you, Anne, right in the middle of the parlor, from the lamp hook in the ceiling. Wasn't that like a man? It was the anniversary of his wedding day, too. Nice, tasty time to pick for it, wasn't it? And, of course, that poor Leslie had to be the one to find him. She went into the parlor that morning singing, with some fresh flowers for the vases, and there she saw her father hanging from the ceiling, his face as black as coal. It was something awful, believe me." "Oh, how horrible," said Anne, shuddering. "The poor, poor child." Leslie didn't cry at her father's funeral any more than she had cried at Kenneth's. Rose whooped and howled for two, however, and Leslie had all she could do trying to calm and comfort her mother. I was disgusted with Rose, and so was everyone else, but Leslie never got out of patience. She loved her mother. Leslie is clannish. Her own could never do wrong in her eyes. Well, they buried Frank West beside Kenneth, and Rose put up a great monument to him. It was bigger than his character, believe me. Anyhow, it was bigger than Rose could afford, for the farm was mortgaged for more than its value. But not long after, Leslie's old grandmother West died, and she left Leslie a little money, enough to give her a year at Queen's Academy. Leslie had made up her mind to pass for a teacher if she could, and then earn enough to put herself through Redmond College. That had been her father's pet scheme. He wanted her to have what he had lost. Leslie was full of ambition, and her head was chock full of brains. She went to Queen's, and she took 2 years' work in 1 year and got her first, and when she came home she got the Glen School. She was so happy and hopeful and full of life and eagerness. When I think of what she was then and what she is now, I say, drat the men. Miss Cornelia snipped her thread off as viciously as if, Nero-like, she was severing the neck of mankind by the stroke. Dick Moore came into her life that summer. His father, Abner Moore, kept the store at the Glen, but Dick had a seagoing streak in him from his mother. He used to sail in summer and clerk in his father's store in winter. He was a big, handsome fellow with a little ugly soul. He was always wanting something till he got it, and then he stopped wanting it, just like a man. Oh, he didn't growl at the weather when it was fine, and he was mostly real pleasant and agreeable when everything went right, but he drank a good deal, and there was some nasty stories told of him and a girl down at the fishing village. He wasn't fit for Leslie to wipe her feet on, that's the long and short of it. And he was a Methodist. But he was clean mad about her, because of her good looks in the first place, and because she wouldn't have anything to say to him in the second. He vowed he'd have her, and he got her. How did he bring it about? Oh, it was an iniquitous thing. I'll never forgive Rose West. You see, Anne dearie, Abner Moore held the mortgage on the West farm, and the interest was overdue some years, and Dick just went and told Mrs. West that if Leslie wouldn't marry him, he'd get his father to foreclose the mortgage. Rose carried on dreadful, fainted and wept and pleaded with Leslie not to let her be turned out of her home. She said it would break her heart to leave the home she'd come to as a bride. I wouldn't have blamed her for feeling bad over it, but you wouldn't have thought she'd be so selfish as to sacrifice her own flesh and blood because of it, would you? Well, she was. And Leslie gave in. She loved her mother so much she would have done anything to save her pain. She married Dick Moore. None of us knew why at the time. It wasn't till long afterward that I found out how her mother had worried her into it. I was sure there was something wrong, though, because I knew she had snubbed him time and again, and it wasn't like Leslie to turn face about like that. Besides, I knew that Dick Moore wasn't the kind of man Leslie could ever fancy, in spite of his good looks and dashing ways. Of course, there was no wedding, but Rose asked me to go and see them married. I went, but I was sorry I did. I'd seen Leslie's face at her brother's funeral and at her father's funeral, and now it seemed to me I was seeing it at her own funeral. But Rose was smiling as a basket of chips, believe me. Leslie and Dick settled down on the West Place. Rose couldn't bear to part with her dear daughter, and lived there for the winter. In the spring, Rose took pneumonia and died, a year too late. Leslie was heartbroken enough over it. Isn't it terrible the way some unworthy folks are loved, while others that deserve it far more, you'd think, never get much affection? As for Dick, he'd had enough of quiet married life, just like a man. He was for up and off. He went over to Nova Scotia to visit his relations. His father had come from Nova Scotia, and he wrote back to Leslie that his cousin George Moore was going on a voyage to Havana, and he was going too. The name of the vessel was the Four Sisters, and they were to be gone about 9 weeks. It must have been a relief to Leslie, but she never said anything. From the day of her marriage, she was just what she is now, cold and proud, and keeping everyone but me at a distance. I won't be kept at a distance, believe me. I've just stuck to Leslie as close as I knew how, in spite of everything." "She told me you were the best friend she had," said Anne. "Did she?" exclaimed Miss Cornelia delightedly. "Well, I'm real thankful to hear it. Sometimes I've wondered if she really did want me around at all. She never let me think so. You must have thought her out more than you think, or she wouldn't have said that much itself to you. Oh, that poor heartbroken girl. I never see Dick Moore, but I want to run a knife clean through him." Miss Cornelia wiped her eyes again, and having relieved her feelings by her bloodthirsty wish, took up her tale. "Well, Leslie was left over there alone. Dick had put in the crop before he went, and old Abner looked after it. The summer went by, and the Four Sisters didn't come back. The Nova Scotia Moores investigated and found she had got to Havana and discharged her cargo and took on another and left for home, and that was all they ever found out about her. By degrees people began to talk of Dick Moore as one that was dead. Almost everyone believed that he was, though no one felt certain, for men have turned up here at the harbor after they'd been gone for years. Leslie never thought he was dead, and she was right. 1,000 pities, too. The next summer Captain Jim was in Havana. That was before he gave up the sea, of course. He thought he'd poke around a bit. Captain Jim always was meddlesome, just like a man, and he went to inquiring round among the sailors' boarding houses and places like that to see if he could find out anything about the crew of the Four Sisters. He'd better have let sleeping dogs lie, in my opinion. Well, he went to one out-of-the-way place, and there he found a man he knew at first sight was Dick Moore, though he had a big beard. Captain Jim got it shaved off, and there was no doubt. Dick Moore it was. His body, at least. His mind wasn't there. As for his soul, in my opinion, he never had one." "What had happened to him?" "Nobody knows the rights of it. All the folks who kept the boarding house could tell was that about a year before they had found him lying on their doorstep one morning in an awful condition, his head battered to a jelly almost. They supposed he'd got hurt in some drunken row, and likely that's the truth of it. They took him in, never thinking he could live, but he did, and he was just like a child when he got well. He hadn't memory or intellect or reason. They tried to find out who he was, but they never could. He couldn't even tell them his name. He could only say a few simple words. He had a letter on him beginning Dear Dick and signed Leslie, but there was no address on it, and the envelope was gone. They let him stay on. He learned to do a few odd jobs about the place, and there Captain Jim found him. He brought him home. I've always said it was a bad day's work, though I suppose there was nothing else he could do. He thought maybe when Dick got home and saw his old surroundings and familiar faces, his memory would wake up, but it hadn't any effect. There he's been at the house up the brook ever since. He's just like a child, no more nor less. Takes fractious spells occasionally, but mostly he's just vacant and good-humored and harmless. He's apt to run away if he isn't watched. That's the burden Leslie has had to carry for 11 years, and all alone. Old Abner Moore died soon after Dick was brought home, and it was found he was almost bankrupt. When things were settled up, there was nothing for Leslie and Dick but the old West farm. Leslie rented it to John Ward, and the rent is all she has to live on. Sometimes in summer she takes a boarder to help out, but most visitors prefer the other side of the harbor where the hotels and summer cottages are. Leslie's house is too far from the bathing shore. She's taken care of Dick, and she's never been away from him for 11 years. She's tied to that imbecile for life. And after all the dreams and hopes she once had, you can imagine what it has been like for her, Anne dearie, with her beauty and spirit and pride and cleverness. It's just been a living death." "Poor, poor girl," said Anne again. Her own happiness seemed to reproach her. What right had she to be so happy when another human soul must be so miserable? "Will you tell me just what Leslie said and how she acted the night you met her on the shore?" asked Miss Cornelia. She listened intently and nodded her satisfaction. You thought she was stiff and cold, Anne dearie, but I can tell you she thawed out wonderful for her. She must have taken to you real strong. I'm so glad. You may be able to help her a good deal. I was thankful when I heard that a young couple was coming to this house, for I hoped it would mean some friends for Leslie, especially if you belong to the race that knows Joseph. You will be her friend, won't you, Anne dearie?" "Indeed I will, if she'll let me," said Anne, with all her own sweet, impulsive earnestness. "No, you must be her friend whether she'll let you or not," said Miss Cornelia resolutely. "Don't you mind if she's stiff by times. Don't notice it. Remember what her life has been, and is, and always must be, I suppose, for creatures like Dick Moore live forever, I understand. You should see how fat he's got since he came home. He used to be lean enough. Just make her be friends. You can do it. You're one of those who have the knack. Only you mustn't be sensitive, and don't mind if she doesn't seem to want you to go over there much. She knows that some women don't like to be where Dick is. They complain he gives them the creeps. Just get her to come over here as often as she can. She can't get away so very much. She can't leave Dick long, for the Lord knows what he'd do, burn the house down most likely. At nights, after he's in bed and asleep, is about the only time she's free. He always goes to bed early and sleeps like the dead till next morning. That is how you came to meet her at the shore, likely. She wanders there considerable." "I will do everything I can for her," said Anne. Her interest in Leslie Moore, which had been vivid ever since she had seen her driving her geese down the hill, was intensified 1,000-fold by Miss Cornelia's narration. The girl's beauty and sorrow and loneliness drew her with an irresistible fascination. She had never known anyone like her. Her friends had hitherto been wholesome, normal, merry girls like herself, with only the average trials of human care and bereavement to shadow their girlish dreams. Leslie Moore stood apart, a tragic, appealing figure of thwarted womanhood. Anne resolved that she would win entrance into the kingdom of that lonely soul, and find there the comradeship it could so richly give, were it not for the cruel fetters that held it in a prison not of its own making. "And mind you this, Anne dearie," said Miss Cornelia, who had not yet wholly relieved her mind. "You mustn't think Leslie is an infidel because she hardly ever goes to church, or even that she's a Methodist. She can't take Dick to church, of course, not that he ever troubled church much in his best days. But you must remember that she's a real strong Presbyterian at heart, Anne dearie." End of chapter 11. Chapter 12. Leslie Comes Over. Leslie came over to the House of Dreams one frosty October night, when moonlit mists were hanging over the harbor and curling like silver ribbons along the seaward glens. She looked as if she repented coming when Gilbert answered her knock, but Anne flew past him, pounced on her, and drew her in. "I'm so glad you picked tonight for a call," she said gaily. "I made up a lot of extra good fudge this afternoon, and we want someone to help us eat it before the fire while we tell stories. Perhaps Captain Jim will drop in too. This is his night." "No, Captain Jim is over home," said Leslie. He made me come here," she added half defiantly. "I'll say a thank you to him for that when I see him," said Anne, pulling easy chairs before the fire. "Oh, I don't mean that I didn't want to come," protested Leslie, flushing a little. I've been thinking of coming, but it isn't always easy for me to get away." "Of course, it must be hard for you to leave Mr. Moore," said Anne in a matter-of-fact tone. She had decided that it would be best to mention Dick Moore occasionally as an accepted fact, and not give undue morbidness to the subject by avoiding it. She was right, for Leslie's air of constraint suddenly vanished. Evidently she had been wondering how much Anne knew of the conditions of her life, and was relieved that no explanations were needed. She allowed her cap and jacket to be taken, and sat down with a girlish snuggle in the big armchair by Magog. She was dressed prettily and carefully, with the customary touch of color in the scarlet geranium at her white throat. Her beautiful hair gleamed like molten gold in the warm firelight. Her sea-blue eyes were full of soft laughter and allurement. For the moment, under the influence of the little house of dreams, she was a girl again, a girl forgetful of the past and its bitterness. The atmosphere of the many loves that had sanctified the little house was all about her. The companionship of two healthy, happy young folks of her own generation encircled her. She felt and yielded to the magic of her surroundings. Miss Cornelia and Jim would scarcely have recognized her. Anne found it hard to believe that this was the cold, unresponsive woman she had met on the shore, this animated girl who talked and listened with the eagerness of a starved soul. and how hungrily Leslie's eyes looked at the bookcases between the windows. "Our library isn't very extensive," said Anne, "but every book in it is a friend. We've picked our books up through the years, here and there, never buying one until we had first read it and knew that it belonged to the race of Joseph." Leslie laughed, beautiful laughter, that seemed akin to all the mirth that had echoed through the little house in the vanished years. "I have a few books of my father's, not many," she said. "I've read them until I know them almost by heart. I don't get many books. There's a circulating library at the Glen store, but I don't think the committee who pick the books for Mr. Parker know what books are of Joseph's race, or perhaps they don't care. It was so seldom I got one I really liked that I gave up getting any." "I hope you'll look on our bookshelves as your own," said Anne. "You are entirely and wholeheartedly welcome to the loan of any book on them." "You're setting a feast of fat things before me," said Leslie joyously. Then, as the clock struck 10, she rose, half unwillingly. "I must go. I didn't realize it was so late. Captain Jim is always saying it doesn't take long to stay an hour, but I've stayed too, and oh, but I've enjoyed them," she added frankly. "Come often," said Anne and Gilbert. They had risen and stood together in the firelight's glow. Leslie looked at them, youthful, hopeful, happy, typifying all she had missed and must forever miss. The light went out of her face and eyes. The girl vanished. It was the sorrowful, cheated woman who answered the invitation almost coldly and got herself away with a pitiful haste. Anne watched her until she was lost in the shadows of the chill and misty night. Then she turned slowly back to the glow of her own radiant hearthstone. "Isn't she lovely, Gilbert? Her hair fascinates me. Miss Cornelia says it reaches to her feet. Ruby Gillis had beautiful hair, but Leslie's is alive. Every thread of it is living gold." "She is very beautiful," agreed Gilbert, so heartily that Anne almost wished he were a little less enthusiastic. "Gilbert, would you like my hair better if it were like Leslie's?" she asked wistfully. "I wouldn't have your hair any color but just what it is for the world," said Gilbert, with one or two convincing accompaniments. "You wouldn't be Anne if you had golden hair, or hair of any color but—" "Red," said Anne, with gloomy satisfaction. "Yes, red, to give warmth to that milk-white skin and those shining gray-green eyes of yours. Golden hair wouldn't suit you at all, Queen Anne. My Queen Anne, queen of my heart and life and home." "Then you may admire Leslie's all you like," said Anne magnanimously. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13. A Ghostly Evening. One evening, a week later, Anne decided to run over the fields to the house up the brook for an informal call. It was an evening of gray fog that had crept in from the Gulf, swathed the harbor, filled the glens and valleys, and clung heavily to the autumnal meadows. Through it the sea sobbed and shuddered. Anne saw Four Winds in a new aspect and found it weird and mysterious and fascinating, but it also gave her a little feeling of loneliness. Gilbert was away and would be away until the morrow, attending a medical powwow in Charlottetown. Anne longed for an hour of fellowship with some girlfriend. Captain Jim and Miss Cornelia were good fellows each in their own way, but youth yearned to youth. "If only Diana or Phil or Pris or Stella could drop in for a chat," she said to herself, "how delightful it would be. This is such a ghostly night. I'm sure all the ships that ever sailed out of Four Winds to their doom could be seen tonight sailing up the harbor with their drowned crews on their decks, if that shrouding fog could be suddenly drawn aside. I feel as if it concealed innumerable mysteries, as if I were surrounded by the wraiths of old generations of Four Winds people peering at me through that gray veil. If ever the dear dead ladies of this little house came back to revisit it, they would come on just such a night as this. If I sit here any longer, I'll see one of them there opposite me in Gilbert's chair. This place isn't exactly canny tonight. Even Gog and Magog have an air of pricking up their ears to hear the footsteps of unseen guests. I'll run over to see Leslie before I frighten myself with my own fancies, as I did long ago in the matter of the haunted wood. I'll leave my house of dreams to welcome back its old inhabitants. My fire will give them goodwill and greeting. They will be gone before I come back, and my house will be mine once more. Tonight I am sure it is keeping a tryst with the past." Laughing a little over her fancy, yet with something of a creepy sensation in the region of her spine, Anne kissed her hand to Gog and Magog and slipped out into the fog, with some of the new magazines under her arm for Leslie. "Leslie's wild for books and magazines," Miss Cornelia had told her, "and she hardly ever sees one. She can't afford to buy them or subscribe for them. She's really pitifully poor, Anne. I don't see how she makes out to live at all on the little rent the farm brings in. She never even hints a complaint on the score of poverty, but I know what it must be. She's been handicapped by it all her life. She didn't mind it when she was free and ambitious, but it must gall now, believe me. I'm glad she seemed so bright and merry the evening she spent with you. Captain Jim told me he had fairly to put her cap and coat on and push her out of the door. Don't be too long in going to see her, either. If you are, she'll think it's because you don't like the sight of Dick, and she'll crawl into her shell again. Dick's a great big harmless baby, but that silly grin and chuckle of his do get on some people's nerves. Thank goodness I've no nerves myself. I like Dick more better now than I ever did when he was in his right senses, though the Lord knows that isn't saying much. I was down there one day in house-cleaning time helping Leslie a bit, and I was frying doughnuts. Dick was hanging round to get one, as usual, and all at once he picked up a scalding hot one I'd just fished out and dropped it on the back of my neck when I was bending over. Then he laughed and laughed. Believe me, Anne, it took all the grace of God in my heart to keep me from just whisking up that stew-pan of boiling fat and pouring it over his head." Anne laughed over Miss Cornelia's wrath as she sped through the darkness. But laughter accorded ill with that night. She was sober enough when she reached the house among the willows. Everything was very silent. The front part of the house seemed dark and deserted, so Anne slipped round to the side door, which opened from the veranda into a little sitting room. There she halted noiselessly. The door was open. Beyond, in the dimly lighted room, sat Leslie Moore, with her arms flung out on the table and her head bent upon them. She was weeping horribly, with low, fierce, choking sobs, as if some agony in her soul were trying to tear itself out. An old black dog was sitting by her, his nose resting on her lap, his big, doggish eyes full of mute, imploring sympathy and devotion. Anne drew back in dismay. She felt that she could not intermeddle with this bitterness. Her heart ached with a sympathy she might not utter. To go in now would be to shut the door forever on any possible help or friendship. Some instinct warned Anne that the proud, bitter girl would never forgive the one who thus surprised her in her abandonment of despair. Anne slipped noiselessly from the veranda and found her way across the yard. Beyond, she heard voices in the gloom and saw the dim glow of a light. At the gate she met two men, Captain Jim with a lantern, and another who she knew must be Dick Moore, a big man, badly gone to fat, with a broad, round, red face and vacant eyes. Even in the dull light, Anne got the impression that there was something unusual about his eyes. "Is this you, Mistress Blythe?" said Captain Jim. Now, you hadn't ought to be roaming out alone on a night like this. You could get lost in this fog easier than not. Just you wait till I see Dick safe inside the door, and I'll come back and light you over the fields. I ain't gonna have Dr. Blythe coming home and finding that you walked clean over Cape LaForce in the fog. A woman did that once, 40 years ago." "So you've been over to see Leslie," he said when he rejoined her. "I didn't go in," said Anne, and told what she had seen. Captain Jim sighed. Poor little girl. She don't cry often, Mistress Blythe. She's too brave for that. She must feel terrible when she does cry. A night like this is hard on poor women who have sorrows. There's something about it that kind of brings up all we've suffered or feared." "It's full of ghosts," said Anne with a shiver. "That was why I came over. I wanted to clasp a human hand and hear a human voice. There seemed to be so many inhuman presences about tonight. Even my own dear house was full of them. They fairly elbowed me out, so I fled over here for companionship of my kind." "You were right not to go in, though, Mistress Blythe. Leslie wouldn't have liked it. She wouldn't have liked me going in with Dick, as I'd have done if I hadn't met you. I had Dick down with me all day. I keep him with me as much as I can to help Leslie a bit." "Isn't there something odd about his eyes?" asked Anne. "You noticed that?" "Yes. One is blue and t'other is hazel. His father had the same. It's a Moore peculiarity. That was what told me he was Dick Moore when I saw him first down in Cuby. If it hadn't 'a been for his eyes, I mightn't 'a known him, with his beard and fat. You know, I reckon, that it was me found him and brought him home. Miss Cornelia always says I shouldn't 'a done it, but I can't agree with her. It was the right thing to do, and so 'twas the only thing. There ain't no question in my mind about that. But my old heart aches for Leslie. She's only 28, and she's eaten more bread with sorrow than most women do in 80 years. They walked on in silence for a little while. Presently Anne said, "Do you know, Captain Jim, I never like walking with a lantern. I always have the strangest feeling that just outside the circle of light, just over its edge in the darkness, I'm surrounded by a ring of furtive, sinister things, watching me from the shadows with hostile eyes. I've had that feeling from childhood. What is the reason? I never feel like that when I'm really in the darkness, when it is close all around me. I'm not the least frightened." "I've something of that feeling myself," admitted Captain Jim. "I reckon when the darkness is close to us it is a friend. But when we sort of push it away from us, divorce ourselves from it, so to speak, with lantern light, it becomes an enemy. But the fog is lifting. There's a smart west wind rising, if you notice. The stars will be out when you get home." They were out, and when Anne re-entered her house of dreams, the red embers were still glowing on the hearth, and all the haunting presences were gone. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14. November Days. The splendor of color which had glowed for weeks along the shores of Four Winds Harbor had faded out into the soft gray blue of late autumnal hills. There came many days when fields and shores were dim with misty rain, or shivering before the breath of a melancholy sea wind. Nights, too, of storm and tempest, when Anne sometimes wakened to pray that no ship might be beating up the grim north shore, for if it were so, not even the great faithful light, whirling through the darkness unafraid, could avail to guide it into safe haven. "In November I sometimes feel as if spring could never come again," she sighed, grieving over the hopeless unsightliness of her frosted and bedraggled flower pots. The gay little garden of the schoolmaster's bride was rather a forlorn place now, and the Lombardys and birches were under bare poles, as Captain Jim said. But the fir wood behind the little house was forever green and staunch, and even in November and December there came gracious days of sunshine and purple hazes, when the harbor danced and sparkled as blithely as in midsummer, and the gulf was so softly blue and tender that the storm and the wild wind seemed only things of a long past dream. Anne and Gilbert spent many an autumn evening at the lighthouse. It was always a cheery place. Even when the east wind sang in minor and the sea was dead and gray, hints of sunshine seemed to be lurking all about it. Perhaps this was because the first mate always paraded it in panoply of gold. He was so large and effulgent that one hardly missed the sun, and his resounding purrs formed a pleasant accompaniment to the laughter and conversation which went on round Captain Jim's fireplace. Captain Jim and Gilbert had many long discussions and high converse on matters beyond the ken of cat or king. "I like to ponder on all kinds of problems, though I can't solve 'em," said Captain Jim. "My father held that we should never talk of things we couldn't understand. But if we didn't, Doctor, the subjects for conversation would be mighty few. I reckon the gods laugh many a time to hear us, but what matters so long as we remember that we're only men and don't take to fancying that we're gods ourselves, really, knowing good and evil. I reckon our powwows won't do us or anyone much harm, so let's have another whack at the whence, why, and whither this evening, Doctor." While they whacked, Anne listened or dreamed. Sometimes Leslie went to the lighthouse with them, and she and Anne wandered along the shore in the eerie twilight, or sat on the rocks below the lighthouse until the darkness drove them back to the cheer of the driftwood fire. Then Captain Jim would brew them tea and tell them tales of land and sea and whatsoever might betide the great forgotten world outside. Leslie always seemed to enjoy those lighthouse carousals very much, and bloomed out for the time being into ready wit and beautiful laughter, or glowing-eyed silence. There was a certain tang and savor in the conversation when Leslie was present, which they missed when she was absent. Even when she did not talk, she seemed to inspire others to brilliancy. Captain Jim told his stories better. Gilbert was quicker in argument and repartee. Anne felt little gushes and trickles of fancy and imagination bubbling to her lips under the influence of Leslie's personality. "That girl was born to be a leader in social and intellectual circles, far away from Four Winds," she said to Gilbert as they walked home one night. "She's just wasted here, wasted." Weren't you listening to Captain Jim and yours truly the other night when we discussed that subject generally? We came to the comforting conclusion that the Creator probably knew how to run his universe quite as well as we do, and that, after all, there are no such things as wasted lives, saving and excepting when an individual willfully squanders and wastes his own life, which Leslie Moore certainly hasn't done. And some people might think that a Redmond B.A., whom editors were beginning to honor, was wasted as the wife of a struggling country doctor in the rural community of Four Winds. Gilbert! If you had married Roy Gardner now, continued Gilbert mercilessly, you could have been a leader in social and intellectual circles far away from Four Winds. Gilbert Blythe! You know you were in love with him at one time, Anne. Gilbert, that's mean. Pisen mean, just like all the men, as Miss Cornelia says. I never was in love with him. I only imagined I was. You know that. You know I'd rather be your wife in our house of dreams and fulfillment than a queen in a palace. Gilbert's answer was not in words, but I'm afraid that both of them forgot poor Leslie speeding her lonely way across the fields to a house that was neither a palace nor the fulfillment of a dream. The moon was rising over the sad, dark sea behind them and transfiguring it. Her light had not yet reached the harbor, the further side of which was shadowy and suggestive, with dim coves and rich glooms and jeweling lights. "How the home light shines out tonight through the dark," said Anne. "That string of them over the harbor looks like a necklace. And what a coruscation there is up at the Glen. Oh, look, Gilbert, there is ours. I'm so glad we left it burning. I hate to come home to a dark house. Our home light, Gilbert. Isn't it lovely to see? Just like one of Earth's many millions of homes, Anne girl. But ours. Ours. Our beacon in a naughty world. When a fellow has a home and a dear little red-haired wife in it, what more need he ask of life?" "Well, he might ask one thing more," whispered Anne happily. "Oh, Gilbert, it seems as if I just couldn't wait for the spring." End of Chapter 14. Chapter 15. Christmas at Four Winds. At first, Anne and Gilbert talked of going home to Avonlea for Christmas, but eventually they decided to stay in Four Winds. "I want to spend the first Christmas of our life together in our own home," decreed Anne. So it fell out that Marilla and Mrs. Rachel Lynde and the twins came to Four Winds for Christmas. Marilla had the face of a woman who had circumnavigated the globe. She had never been 60 miles away from home before, and she had never eaten a Christmas dinner anywhere save at Green Gables. Mrs. Rachel had made and brought with her an enormous plum pudding. Nothing could have convinced Mrs. Rachel that a college graduate of the younger generation could make a Christmas plum pudding properly, but she bestowed approval on Anne's house. "Anne's a good housekeeper," she said to Marilla in the spare room the night of their arrival. "I've looked into her bread box and her scrap pail. I always judge a housekeeper by those, that's what. There's nothing in the pail that shouldn't have been thrown away, and no stale pieces in the bread box. Of course, she was trained up with you, but then she went to college afterwards. I notice she's got my tobacco-striped quilt on the bed here, and that big round braided mat of yours before her living room fire. It makes me feel right at home." Anne's first Christmas in her own house was as delightful as she could have wished. The day was fine and bright. The first skin of snow had fallen on Christmas Eve and made the world beautiful. The harbor was still open and glittering. Captain Jim and Miss Cornelia came to dinner. Leslie and Dick had been invited, but Leslie made excuse. They always went to her Uncle Isaac West's for Christmas, she said. She'd rather have it so, Miss Cornelia told Anne. She can't bear taking Dick where there are strangers. Christmas is always a hard time for Leslie. She and her father used to make a lot of it. Miss Cornelia and Mrs. Rachel Lynde did not take a very violent fancy to each other. Two suns hold not their courses in one sphere. But they did not clash at all, for Mrs. Rachel was in the kitchen helping Anne and Marilla with the dinner, and it fell to Gilbert to entertain Captain Jim and Miss Cornelia, or rather to be entertained by them, for a dialogue between those two old friends and antagonists was assuredly never dull. "It's many a year since there was a Christmas dinner here, Mistress Blythe," said Captain Jim. "Miss Russell always went to her friends in town for Christmas. But I was here to the first Christmas dinner that was ever eaten in this house, and the schoolmaster's bride cooked it. That was 60 years ago today, Mistress Blythe, and a day very like this, just enough snow to make the hills white, and the harbor as blue as June. I was only a lad, and I'd never been invited out to dinner before, and I was too shy to eat enough. I've got all over that." "Most men do," said Miss Cornelia, sewing furiously. Miss Cornelia was not going to sit with idle hands, even on Christmas. Babies come without any consideration for holidays, and there was one expected in a poverty-stricken household at Glen St. Mary. Miss Cornelia had sent that household a substantial dinner for its little swarm, and so meant to eat her own with a comfortable conscience. "Well, you know the way to a man's heart is through his stomach, Cornelia," explained Captain Jim. "I believe you, when he has a heart," retorted Miss Cornelia. "I suppose that's why so many women kill themselves cooking, just as poor Amelia Baxter did. She died last Christmas morning, and she said it was the first Christmas since she was married that she didn't have to cook a big 20-plate dinner. It must have been a real pleasant change for her. Well, she's been dead a year, so you'll soon hear of Horace Baxter taking notice." "I heard he was taking notice already," said Captain Jim, winking at Gilbert. "Wasn't he up to your place one Sunday lately, with his funeral blacks on and a boiled collar?" "No, he wasn't, and he needn't come neither. I could have had him long ago when he was fresh. I don't want any second-hand goods, believe me. As for Horace Baxter, he was in financial difficulties a year ago last summer, and he prayed to the Lord for help, and when his wife died and he got her life insurance, he said he believed it was the answer to his prayer. Wasn't that like a man?" "Have you really proof that he said that, Cornelia?" "I have the Methodist minister's word for it, if you call that proof. Robert Baxter told me the same thing, too, but I admit that isn't evidence. Robert Baxter isn't often known to tell the truth." Come, Cornelia. I think he generally tells the truth, but he changes his opinion so often it sometimes sounds as if he didn't." "It sounds like it mighty often, believe me. But trust one man to excuse another. I have no use for Robert Baxter. He turned Methodist just because the Presbyterian choir happened to be singing 'Behold, the Bridegroom Cometh' for a collection piece when him and Margaret walked up the aisle the Sunday after they were married. Served him right for being late. He always insisted the choir did it on purpose to insult him, as if he was of that much importance. But that family always thought they were much bigger potatoes than they really were. His brother Eliphalet imagined the devil was always at his elbow, but I never believed the devil wasted that much time on him." "I don't know," said Captain Jim thoughtfully. "Eliphalet Baxter lived too much alone. Hadn't even a cat or dog to keep him human. When a man is alone, he's mighty apt to be with the devil if he ain't with God. He has to choose which company he'll keep, I reckon. If the devil always was at Life Baxter's elbow, it must have been because Life liked to have him there." "Man-like," said Miss Cornelia, and subsided into silence over a complicated arrangement of tucks until Captain Jim deliberately stirred her up again by remarking in a casual way, "I was up to the Methodist church last Sunday morning." "You'd better have been home reading your Bible," was Miss Cornelia's retort. "Come now, Cornelia, I can't see any harm in going to the Methodist church when there's no preaching in your own. I've been a Presbyterian for 76 years, and it isn't likely my theology will hoist anchor at this late day." "It's setting a bad example," said Miss Cornelia grimly. "Besides," continued wicked Captain Jim, "I wanted to hear some good singing. The Methodists have a good choir, and you can't deny, Cornelia, that the singing in our church is awful since the split in the choir." "What if the singing isn't good? They're doing their best, and God sees no difference between the voice of a crow and the voice of a nightingale." Come, Cornelia," said Captain Jim mildly. "I've a better opinion of the Almighty's ear for music than that." "What caused the trouble in our choir?" asked Gilbert, who was suffering from suppressed laughter. "It dates back to the new church 3 years ago," answered Captain Jim. "We had a fearful time over the building of that church. Fell out over the question of a new site. The 2 sites wasn't more'n 200 yards apart, but you'd have thought they was 1,000 by the bitterness of that fight. We was split up into 3 factions. One wanted the east site, and one the south, and one held to the old. It was fought out in bed and at board, and in church and at market. All the old scandals of 3 generations were dragged out of their graves and aired. 3 matches was broken up by it, and the meetings we had to try to settle the question. Cornelia, will you ever forget the one when old Luther Burns got up and made a speech? He stated his opinions forcibly." "Call a spade, Captain. You mean he got red mad and raked them all fore and aft. They deserved it, too, a pack of incapables. But what would you expect of a committee of men? That building committee held 27 meetings, and at the end of the 27th weren't no nearer having a church than when they begun. Not so near, for a fact, for in one fit of hurrying things along, they'd gone to work and tore the old church down, so there we were without a church, and no place but the hall to worship in. The Methodists offered us their church, Cornelia. The Glen St. Mary Church wouldn't have been built to this day, went on Miss Cornelia, ignoring Captain Jim, if we women hadn't just started in and took charge. We said we meant to have a church, if the men meant to quarrel till doomsday, and we were tired of being a laughingstock for the Methodists. We held one meeting and elected a committee and canvassed for subscriptions. We got them, too. When any of the men tried to sass us, we told them they'd tried for 2 years to build a church, and it was our turn now. We shut them up close, believe me, and in 6 months we had our church. Of course, when the men saw we were determined, they stopped fighting and went to work, manlike, as soon as they saw they had to or quit bossing. Oh, women can't preach or be elders, but they can build churches and scare up the money for them. The Methodists allow women to preach, said Captain Jim. Miss Cornelia glared at him. I never said the Methodists hadn't common sense, Captain. What I say is, I doubt if they have much religion. I suppose you're in favor of votes for women, Miss Cornelia, said Gilbert. I'm not hankering after the vote, believe me, said Miss Cornelia scornfully. I know what it is to clean up after the men. But some of these days, when the men realize they've got the world into a mess they can't get it out of, they'll be glad to give us the vote, and shoulder their troubles over on us. That's their scheme. Oh, it's well that women are patient, believe me. What about Job? Suggested Captain Jim. Job? It was such a rare thing to find a patient man that when one was really discovered they were determined he shouldn't be forgotten, retorted Miss Cornelia triumphantly. Anyhow, the virtue doesn't go with the name. There never was such an impatient man born as old Job Taylor over harbor. Well, you know, he had a good deal to try him, Cornelia. Even you can't defend his wife. I always remember what old William McAllister said of her at her funeral. There's nae doot she was a Christian woman, but she had the deil's own temper. I suppose she was trying, admitted Miss Cornelia reluctantly, but that didn't justify what Job said when she died. He rode home from the graveyard the day of the funeral with my father. He never said a word till they got near home. Then he heaved a big sigh and said, "You may not believe it, Stephen, but this is the happiest day of my life." Wasn't that like a man? I suppose poor old Mrs. Job did make life kinder uneasy for him, reflected Captain Jim. Well, there's such a thing as decency, isn't there? Even if a man is rejoicing in his heart over his wife being dead, he needn't proclaim it to the four winds of heaven. And happy day or not, Job Taylor wasn't long in marrying again, you might notice. His second wife could manage him. She made him walk Spanish, believe me. The first thing she did was to make him hustle round and put up a tombstone to the first Mrs. Job, and she had a place left on it for her own name. She said there'd be nobody to make Job put up a monument to her. Speaking of Taylors, how is Mrs. Lewis Taylor up at the Glen, Doctor? Asked Captain Jim. She's getting better slowly, but she has to work too hard, replied Gilbert. Her husband works too hard, raising prize pigs, said Miss Cornelia. He's noted for his beautiful pigs. He's a heap prouder of his pigs than of his children. But then, to be sure, his pigs are the best pigs possible, while his children don't amount to much. He picked a poor mother for them, and starved her while she was bearing and rearing them. His pigs got the cream, and his children got the skim milk. There are times, Cornelia, when I have to agree with you, though it hurts me, said Captain Jim. That's just exactly the truth about Lewis Taylor. When I see those poor miserable children of his, robbed of all children ought to have, it pisons my own bite and sup for days afterwards. Gilbert went out to the kitchen in response to Anne's beckoning. Anne shut the door and gave him a connubial lecture. Gilbert, you and Captain Jim must stop baiting Miss Cornelia. Oh, I've been listening to you, and I just won't allow it. Anne, Miss Cornelia's enjoying herself hugely. You know she is. Well, never mind. You two needn't egg her on like that. Dinner is ready now, and Gilbert, don't let Mrs. Rachel carve the geese. I know she means to offer to do it because she doesn't think you can do it properly. Show her you can. I ought to be able to. I've been studying ABCD diagrams of carving for the past month, said Gilbert. Only don't talk to me while I'm doing it, Anne, for if you drive the letters out of my head, I'll be in a worse predicament than you were in old geometry days when the teacher changed them. Gilbert carved the geese beautifully. Even Mrs. Rachel had to admit that, and everybody ate of them and enjoyed them. Anne's first Christmas dinner was a great success, and she beamed with housewifely pride. Merry was the feast and long, and when it was over they gathered around the cheer of the red hearth flame, and Captain Jim told them stories until the red sun swung low over Four Winds Harbor and the long blue shadows of the Lombardys fell across the snow in the lane. "I must be getting back to the light," he said finally. "I'll just have time to walk home before sundown. Thank you for a beautiful Christmas, Mistress Blythe. Bring Master Davy down to the light some night before he goes home." "I want to see those stone gods," said Davy with a relish. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16. New Year's Eve at the Light. The Green Gables folk went home after Christmas, Marilla under solemn covenant to return for a month in the spring. More snow came before New Year's, and the harbor froze over, but the gulf was still free beyond the white, imprisoned fields. The last day of the old year was one of those bright, cold, dazzling winter days which bombard us with their brilliancy and command our admiration, but never our love. The sky was sharp and blue, the snow diamonds sparkled insistently, the stark trees were bare and shameless, with a kind of brazen beauty. The hills shot assaulting lances of crystal. Even the shadows were sharp and stiff and clear-cut, as no proper shadows should be. Everything that was handsome seemed 10 times handsomer and less attractive in the glaring splendor, and everything that was ugly seemed 10 times uglier, and everything was either handsome or ugly. There was no soft blending or kind obscurity or elusive mistiness in that searching glitter. The only things that held their own individuality were the firs, for the fir is the tree of mystery and shadow, and yields never to the encroachments of crude radiance. But finally the day began to realize that she was growing old. Then a certain pensiveness fell over her beauty, which dimmed yet intensified it. Sharp angles, glittering points, melted away into curves and enticing gleams. The white harbor put on soft grays and pinks, the faraway hills turned amethyst. "The old year is going away beautifully," said Anne. She and Leslie and Gilbert were on their way to the Four Winds Point, having plotted with Captain Jim to watch the New Year in at the light. The sun had set, and in the southwestern sky hung Venus, glorious and golden, having drawn as near to her earth sister as is possible for her. For the first time Anne and Gilbert saw the shadow cast by that brilliant star of evening, that faint, mysterious shadow, never seen save when there is white snow to reveal it, and then only with averted vision, vanishing when you gaze at it directly. "It's like the spirit of a shadow, isn't it?" whispered Anne. "You can see it so plainly haunting your side when you look ahead, but when you turn and look at it, it's gone." "I have heard that you can see the shadow of Venus only once in a lifetime, and that within a year of seeing it your life's most wonderful gift will come to you," said Leslie. But she spoke rather hardly. Perhaps she thought that even the shadow of Venus could bring her no gift of life. Anne smiled in the soft twilight. She felt quite sure what the mystic shadow promised her. They found Marshall Elliott at the lighthouse. At first Anne felt inclined to resent the intrusion of this long-haired, long-bearded eccentric into the familiar little circle. But Marshall Elliott soon proved his legitimate claim to membership in the household of Joseph. He was a witty, intelligent, well-read man, rivaling Captain Jim himself in the knack of telling a good story. They were all glad when he agreed to watch the old year out with them. Captain Jim's small nephew Joe had come down to spend New Year's with his great uncle, and had fallen asleep on the sofa with the first mate curled up in a huge golden ball at his feet. "Ain't he a dear little man?" said Captain Jim gloatingly. "I do love to watch a little child asleep, Mistress Blythe. It's the most beautiful sight in the world, I reckon. Joe does love to get down here for a night, because I have him sleep with me. At home he has to sleep with the other 2 boys, and he doesn't like it. 'Why can't I sleep with father, Uncle Jim?' says he. 'Everybody in the Bible slept with their fathers.' As for the questions he asks, the minister himself couldn't answer them. They fair swamp me. Uncle Jim, if I wasn't me, who'd I be? And, Uncle Jim, what would happen if God died? He fired them two off at me tonight afore he went to sleep. As for his imagination, it sails away from everything. He makes up the most remarkable yarns, and then his mother shuts him up in the closet for telling stories. And he sits down and makes up another one and has it ready to relate to her when she lets him out. He had one for me when he come down tonight. 'Uncle Jim,' says he, solemn as a tombstone, 'I had a venture in the glen today.' 'Yes, what was it?' says I, expecting something quite startling, but nowise prepared for what I really got. 'I met a wolf in the street,' says he, 'enormous wolf with a big red mouth and awful long teeth, Uncle Jim.' 'I didn't know there was any wolves up at the glen,' says I. 'Oh, he comed there from far, far away,' says Joe, 'and I thought he was going to eat me up, Uncle Jim.' 'Were you scared?' says I. 'No, 'cause I had a big gun,' says Joe, 'and I shot the wolf dead, Uncle Jim, solid dead, and then he went up to heaven and bit God,' says he. Well, I was fair staggered, Mistress Blythe." The hours bloomed into mirth around the driftwood fire. Captain Jim told tales, and Marshall Elliott sang old Scotch ballads in a fine tenor voice. Finally Captain Jim took down his old brown fiddle from the wall and began to play. He had a tolerable knack of fiddling, which all appreciated save the first mate, who sprang from the sofa as if he had been shot, emitted a shriek of protest, and fled wildly up the stairs. "Can't cultivate an ear for music in that cat nohow," said Captain Jim. "He won't stay long enough to learn to like it. When we got the organ up at the Glen Church, old Elder Richards bounced up from his seat the minute the organist began to play and scuttled down the aisle and out of the church at the rate of no man's business. It reminded me so strong of the first mate tearing loose as soon as I begun to fiddle that I come near to laughing out loud in church than I ever did before or since." There was something so infectious in the rollicking tunes that Captain Jim played that very soon Marshall Elliott's feet began to twitch. He had been a noted dancer in his youth. Presently he started up and held out his hands to Leslie. Instantly she responded. Round and round the firelit room they circled with a rhythmic grace that was wonderful. Leslie danced like one inspired. The wild, sweet abandon of the music seemed to have entered into and possessed her. Anne watched her in fascinated admiration. She had never seen her like this. All the innate richness and color and charm of her nature seemed to have broken loose and overflowed in crimson cheek and glowing eye and grace of motion. Even the aspect of Marshall Elliott, with his long beard and hair, could not spoil the picture. On the contrary, it seemed to enhance it. Marshall Elliott looked like a Viking of elder days, dancing with one of the blue-eyed, golden-haired daughters of the Northland. "The purtiest dancing I ever saw, and I've seen some in my time," declared Captain Jim, when at last the bow fell from his tired hand. Leslie dropped into her chair laughing, breathless. "I love dancing," she said apart to Anne. "I haven't danced since I was 16, but I love it. The music seems to run through my veins like quicksilver, and I forget everything except the delight of keeping time to it. There isn't any floor beneath me, or walls about me, or roof over me. I'm floating amid the stars." Captain Jim hung his fiddle up in its place beside a large frame enclosing several banknotes. "Is there anybody else of your acquaintance who can afford to hang his walls with banknotes for pictures?" he asked. "There's 20 $10 notes there, not worth the glass over them. They're old Bank of P.E. Island notes. Had them by me when the bank failed, and I had 'em framed and hung up, partly as a reminder not to put your trust in banks, and partly to give me a real luxurious millionary feeling. Hallo, matey, don't be scared. You can come back now. The music and revelry is over for tonight. The old year has just another hour to stay with us. I've seen 76 new years come in over that gulf yonder, Mistress Blythe." "You'll see 100, said Marshall Elliott. Captain Jim shook his head. "No, and I don't want to. At least, I think I don't. Death grows friendlier as we grow older. Not that one of us really wants to die, though, Marshall. Tennyson spoke truth when he said that. There's old Mrs. Wallace up at the Glen. She's had heaps of trouble all her life, poor soul, and she's lost almost everyone she cared about. She's always saying that she'll be glad when her time comes, and she doesn't want to sojourn any longer in this vale of tears. But when she takes a sick spell, there's a fuss. Doctors from town and a trained nurse and enough medicine to kill a dog. Life may be a vale of tears, all right, but there are some folks who enjoy weeping, I reckon." They spent the old year's last hour quietly around the fire. A few minutes before 12, Captain Jim rose and opened the door. "We must let the new year in," he said. Outside was a fine blue night. A sparkling ribbon of moonlight garlanded the gulf. Inside the bar, the harbor shone like a pavement of pearl. They stood before the door and waited. Captain Jim with his ripe, full experience, Marshall Elliott in his vigorous but empty middle life, Gilbert and Anne with their precious memories and exquisite hopes, Leslie with her record of starved years and her hopeless future. The clock on the little shelf above the fireplace struck 12. "Welcome, New Year," said Captain Jim, bowing low as the last stroke died away. "I wish you all the best year of your lives, mates. I reckon that whatever the new year brings us will be the best the great captain has for us, and somehow or other we'll all make port in a good harbor." End of Chapter 16. Chapter 17. A Four Winds Winter. Winter set in vigorously after New Year's. Big white drifts heaped themselves about the little house, and palms of frost covered its windows. The harbor ice grew harder and thicker until the Four Winds people began their usual winter traveling over it. The Safeways were bushed by a benevolent government, and night and day the gay tinkle of the sleigh bells sounded on it. On moonlit nights Anne heard them in her house of dreams like fairy chimes. The gulf froze over, and the Four Winds light flashed no more. During the months when navigation was closed, Captain Jim's office was a sinecure. "The first mate and I will have nothing to do till spring except keep warm and amuse ourselves. The last lighthouse keeper used always to move up to the Glen in winter, but I'd rather stay at the Point. The first mate might get poisoned or chewed up by dogs at the Glen. It's a mite lonely, to be sure, with neither the light nor the water for company, but if our friends come to see us often, we'll weather it through." Captain Jim had an ice boat, and many a wild, glorious spin Gilbert and Anne and Leslie had over the glib harbor ice with him. Anne and Leslie took long snowshoe tramps together, too, over the fields or across the harbor after storms, or through the woods beyond the Glen. They were very good comrades in their rambles and their fireside communings. Each had something to give the other. Each felt life the richer for friendly exchange of thought and friendly silence. Each looked across the white fields between their homes with a pleasant consciousness of a friend beyond. But in spite of all this, Anne felt that there was always a barrier between Leslie and herself, a constraint that never wholly vanished. "I don't know why I can't get closer to her," Anne said one evening to Captain Jim. "I like her so much. I admire her so much. I want to take her right into my heart and creep right into hers, but I can never cross the barrier." "You've been too happy all your life, Mistress Blythe," said Captain Jim thoughtfully. "I reckon that's why you and Leslie can't get real close together in your souls. The barrier between you is her experience of sorrow and trouble. She ain't responsible for it, and you ain't. But it's there, and neither of you can cross it." "My childhood wasn't very happy before I came to Green Gables," said Anne, gazing soberly out of the window at the still, sad, dead beauty of the leafless tree shadows on the moonlit snow. "Maybe not. But it was just the usual unhappiness of a child who hasn't anyone to look after it properly. There hasn't been any tragedy in your life, Mistress Blythe, and poor Leslie's has been almost all tragedy. She feels, I reckon, though maybe she hardly knows she feels it, that there's a vast deal in her life you can't enter nor understand, and so she has to keep you back from it, hold you off, so to speak, from hurting her. You know, if we've got anything about us that hurts, we shrink from anyone's touch on or near it. It holds good with our souls as well as our bodies, I reckon. Leslie's soul must be near raw. It's no wonder she hides it away." "If that were really all, I wouldn't mind, Captain Jim. I would understand. But there are times, not always, but now and again, when I almost have to believe that Leslie doesn't like me. Sometimes I surprise a look in her eyes that seems to show resentment and dislike. It goes so quickly, but I've seen it, I'm sure of that. And it hurts me, Captain Jim. I'm not used to being disliked, and I've tried so hard to win Leslie's friendship." "You have won it, Mistress Blythe. Don't you go cherishing any foolish notion that Leslie don't like you. If she didn't, she wouldn't have anything to do with you, much less chumming with you as she does. I know Leslie Moore too well not to be sure of that." The first time I ever saw her, driving her geese down the hill on the day I came to Four Winds, she looked at me with the same expression, persisted Anne. I felt it, even in the midst of my admiration of her beauty. She looked at me resentfully. She did indeed, Captain Jim. "The resentment must have been about something else, Mistress Blythe, and you just come in for a share of it because you happened past. Leslie does take sullen spells now and again, poor girl. I can't blame her, when I know what she has to put up with. I don't know why it's permitted. The doctor and I have talked a lot about the origin of evil, but we haven't quite found out all about it yet. There's a vast of ununderstandable things in life, ain't there, Mistress Blythe? Sometimes things seem to work out real proper like, same as with you and the doctor. And then again they all seem to go catawampus. There's Leslie, so clever and beautiful you'd think she was meant for a queen, and instead she's cooped up over there, robbed of almost everything a woman'd value, with no prospect except waiting on Dick Moore all her life. Though, mind you, Mistress Blythe, I dare say she'd choose her life now, such as it is, rather than the life she lived with Dick before he went away. That's something a clumsy old sailor's tongue mustn't meddle with. But you've helped Leslie a lot. She's a different creature since you come to Four Winds. Us old friends see the difference in her as you can't. Miss Cornelia and me was talking it over the other day, and it's one of the mighty few pints that we see eye to eye on. So just you throw overboard any idea of her not liking you." Anne could hardly discard it completely, for there were undoubtedly times when she felt, with an instinct that was not to be combated by reason, that Leslie harbored a queer, indefinable resentment towards her. At times, this secret consciousness marred the delight of their comradeship. At others, it was almost forgotten. But Anne always felt the hidden thorn was there and might prick her at any moment. She felt a cruel sting from it on the day when she told Leslie of what she hoped the spring would bring to the little house of dreams. Leslie looked at her with hard, bitter, unfriendly eyes. "So you are to have that too," she said in a choked voice. And without another word she had turned and gone across the fields homeward. Anne was deeply hurt. For the moment she felt as if she could never like Leslie again. But when Leslie came over a few evenings later, she was so pleasant, so friendly, so frank and witty and winsome, that Anne was charmed into forgiveness and forgetfulness. Only she never mentioned her darling hope to Leslie again, nor did Leslie ever refer to it. But one evening, when late winter was listening for the word of spring, she came over to the little house for a twilight chat, and when she went away she left a small white box on the table. Anne found it after she was gone and opened it wonderingly. In it was a tiny white dress of exquisite workmanship, delicate embroidery, wonderful tucking, sheer loveliness. Every stitch in it was handwork, and the little frills of lace at neck and sleeves were of real Valenciennes. Lying on it was a card, with Leslie's love. "What hours of work she must have put on it," said Anne. "And the material must have cost more than she could really afford. It is very sweet of her." But Leslie was brusque and curt when Anne thanked her, and again the latter felt thrown back upon herself. Leslie's gift was not alone in the little house. Miss Cornelia had, for the time being, given up sewing for unwanted, unwelcome eighth babies and fallen to sewing for a very much wanted first one, whose welcome would leave nothing to be desired. Philippa Blake and Diana Wright each sent a marvelous garment, and Mrs. Rachel Lynde sent several, in which good material and honest stitches took the place of embroidery and frills. Anne herself made many, desecrated by no touch of machinery, spending over them the happiest hours of the happy winter. Captain Jim was the most frequent guest of the little house, and none was more welcome. Every day Anne loved the simple-souled, true-hearted old sailor more and more. He was as refreshing as a sea breeze, as interesting as some ancient chronicle. She was never tired of listening to his stories, and his quaint remarks and comments were a continual delight to her. Captain Jim was one of those rare and interesting people who never speak but they say something. The milk of human kindness and the wisdom of the serpent were mingled in his composition in delightful proportions. Nothing ever seemed to put Captain Jim out or depress him in any way. "I've kind of contracted a habit of enjoying things," he remarked once, when Anne had commented on his invariable cheerfulness. "It's got so chronic that I believe I even enjoy the disagreeable things. It's great fun thinking they can't last. 'Old rheumatiz,' says I when it grips me hard, 'you've got to stop aching sometime. The worse you are, the sooner you'll stop, maybe. I'm bound to get the better of you in the long run, whether in the body or out of the body.'" One night, by the fireside at the light, Anne saw Captain Jim's life book. He needed no coaxing to show it, and proudly gave it to her to read. "I writ it to leave to little Joe," he said. "I don't like the idea of everything I've done and seen being clean forgot after I've slipped for my last voyage. Joe, he'll remember it and tell the yarns to his children." It was an old leather-bound book filled with the record of his voyages and adventures. Anne thought what a treasure trove it would be to a writer. Every sentence was a nugget. In itself, the book had no literary merit. Captain Jim's charm of storytelling failed him when he came to pen and ink. He could only jot roughly down the outline of his famous tales, and both spelling and grammar were sadly askew. But Anne felt that if anyone possessed of the gift could take that simple record of a brave, adventurous life, reading between the bald lines the tales of dangers staunchly faced and duty manfully done, a wonderful story might be made from it. Rich comedy and thrilling tragedy were both lying hidden in Captain Jim's life book, waiting for the touch of the master hand to waken the laughter and grief and horror of thousands. Anne said something of this to Gilbert as they walked home. "Why don't you try your hand at it yourself, Anne?" Anne shook her head. "No, I only wish I could, but it's not in the power of my gift. You know what my forte is, Gilbert, the fanciful, the fairy-like, the pretty. To write Captain Jim's life book as it should be written, one should be a master of vigorous yet subtle style, a keen psychologist, a born humorist and a born tragedian. A rare combination of gifts is needed. Paul might do it if he were older. Anyhow, I'm going to ask him to come down next summer and meet Captain Jim." "Come to this shore," wrote Anne to Paul. "I'm afraid you cannot find here Nora or the Golden Lady or the Twin Sailors, but you will find one old sailor who can tell you wonderful stories." Paul, however, wrote back, saying regretfully that he could not come that year. He was going abroad for 2 years' study. "When I return, I'll come to Four Winds, teacher," he wrote. "But meanwhile Captain Jim is growing old," said Anne sorrowfully, "and there is nobody to write his life book." End of chapter 17. Chapter 18. Spring Days. The ice in the harbor grew black and rotten in the March suns. In April there were blue waters and a windy, white-capped gulf again, and again the Four Winds light begemmed the twilights. "I'm so glad to see it once more," said Anne on the first evening of its reappearance. "I've missed it so all winter. The northwestern sky has seemed blank and lonely without it." The land was tender with brand new, golden green baby leaves. There was an emerald mist on the woods beyond the glen. The seaward valleys were full of fairy mists at dawn. Vibrant winds came and went with salt foam in their breath. The sea laughed and flashed and preened and allured like a beautiful, coquettish woman. The herrings schooled, and the fishing village woke to life. The harbor was alive with white sails making for the channel. The ships began to sail outward and inward again. "On a spring day like this," said Anne, "I know exactly what my soul will feel like on the resurrection morning." "There are times in spring when I sort of feel that I might have been a poet if I'd been caught young," remarked Captain Jim. "I catch myself conning over old lines and verses I heard the schoolmaster reciting 60 years ago. They don't trouble me at other times. Now I feel as if I had to get out on the rocks or the fields or the water and spout them." Captain Jim had come up that afternoon to bring Anne a load of shells for her garden and a little bunch of sweetgrass which he had found in a ramble over the sand dunes. "It's getting real scarce along this shore now," he said. "When I was a boy there was a plenty of it, but now it's only once in a while you'll find a plot, and never when you're looking for it. You just have to stumble on it. You're walking along the sand hills, never thinking of sweetgrass, and all at once the air is full of sweetness, and there's the grass under your feet. I favor the smell of sweetgrass. It always makes me think of my mother." "She was fond of it?" asked Anne. "Not that I knows on. Dunno's she ever saw any sweetgrass. No, it's because it has a kind of motherly perfume. Not too young, you understand. Something kind of seasoned and wholesome and dependable, just like a mother. The schoolmaster's bride always kept it among her handkerchiefs. You might put that little bunch among yours, Mistress Blythe. I don't like these boughten scents, but a whiff of sweetgrass belongs anywhere a lady does." Anne had not been especially enthusiastic over the idea of surrounding her flower beds with quahog shells. As a decoration they did not appeal to her on first thought, but she would not have hurt Captain Jim's feelings for anything, so she assumed a virtue she did not at first feel and thanked him heartily. And when Captain Jim had proudly encircled every bed with a rim of the big, milk-white shells, Anne found to her surprise that she liked the effect. On a town lawn, or even up at the Glen, they would not have been in keeping, but here, in the old-fashioned sea-bound garden of the little house of dreams, they belonged. "They do look nice," she said sincerely. "The schoolmaster's bride always had cowhogs round her beds," said Captain Jim. "She was a master hand with flowers. She looked at 'em and touched 'em so, and they grew like mad. Some folks have that knack. I reckon you have it too, Mistress Blythe." "Oh, I don't know. But I love my garden, and I love working in it. To potter with green, growing things, watching each day to see the dear new sprouts come up, is like taking a hand in creation, I think. Just now my garden is like faith, the substance of things hoped for. But bide a wee. It always amazes me to look at the little wrinkled brown seeds and think of the rainbows in 'em," said Captain Jim. "When I ponder on them seeds, I don't find it nowise hard to believe that we've got souls that'll live in other worlds. You couldn't hardly believe there was life in them tiny things, some no bigger than grains of dust, let alone color and scent, if you hadn't seen the miracle, could you?" Anne, who was counting her days like silver beads on a rosary, could not now take the long walk to the lighthouse or up the Glen road. But Miss Cornelia and Captain Jim came very often to the little house. Miss Cornelia was the joy of Anne's and Gilbert's existence. They laughed side-splittingly over her speeches after every visit. When Captain Jim and she happened to visit the little house at the same time, there was much sport for the listening. They waged wordy warfare, she attacking, he defending. Anne once reproached the captain for his baiting of Miss Cornelia. "Oh, I do love to set her going, Mistress Blythe," chuckled the unrepentant sinner. "It's the greatest amusement I have in life. That tongue of hers would blister a stone, and you and that young dog of a doctor enjoy listening to her as much as I do." Captain Jim came along another evening to bring Anne some mayflowers. The garden was full of the moist, scented air of a maritime spring evening. There was a milk-white mist on the edge of the sea, with the young moon kissing it, and a silver gladness of stars over the Glen. The bell of the church across the harbor was ringing dreamily sweet. The mellow chime drifted through the dusk to mingle with the soft spring moan of the sea. Captain Jim's mayflowers added the last completing touch to the charm of the night. "I haven't seen any this spring, and I've missed them," said Anne, burying her face in them. "They ain't to be found around Four Winds, only in the barrens away behind the Glen up yonder. I took a little trip today to the land of nothing to do and hunted these up for you. I reckon they're the last you'll see this spring, for they're nearly done." "How kind and thoughtful you are, Captain Jim. Nobody else, not even Gilbert," with a shake of her head at him, "remembered that I always long for mayflowers in the spring." "Well, I had another errand, too. I wanted to take Mr. Howard back yonder a mess of trout. He likes one occasional, and it's all I can do for a kindness he did me once. I stayed all the afternoon and talked to him. He likes to talk to me, though he's a highly educated man, and I'm only an ignorant old sailor, because he's one of the folks that's got to talk, or they're miserable, and he finds listeners scarce round here. The Glen folks might shy of him because they think he's an infidel. He ain't that far gone exactly. Few men is, I reckon. But he's what you might call a heretic. Heretics are wicked, but they're mighty interesting. It's just that they've got sort of lost looking for God, being under the impression that he's hard to find, which he ain't never. Most of 'em blunder to him after a while, I guess. I don't think listening to Mr. Howard's arguments is likely to do me much harm. Mind you, I believe what I was brought up to believe. It saves a vast bother. And back of it all, God is good. The trouble with Mr. Howard is that he's a little too clever. He thinks that he's bound to live up to his cleverness, and that it's smarter to thrash out some new way of getting to heaven than to go by the old track the common ignorant folks is traveling. But he'll get there sometime, all right, and then he'll laugh at himself." "Mr. Howard was a Methodist to begin with," said Miss Cornelia, as if she thought he had not far to go from that to heresy. "Do you know, Cornelia," said Captain Jim gravely, "I've often thought that if I wasn't a Presbyterian I'd be a Methodist." "Oh, well," conceded Miss Cornelia, "if you weren't a Presbyterian it wouldn't matter much what you were. Speaking of heresy reminds me, Doctor, I've brought back that book you lent me, that Natural Law in the Spiritual World. I didn't read more'n a word of it. I can read sense and I can read nonsense, but that book is neither the one nor the other." "It is considered rather heretical in some quarters," admitted Gilbert. "But I told you that before you took it, Miss Cornelia." "Oh, I wouldn't have minded its being heretical. I can stand wickedness, but I can't stand foolishness," said Miss Cornelia calmly, and with the air of having said the last thing there was to say about natural law. "Speaking of books, a mad love come to an end at last 2 weeks ago," remarked Captain Jim musingly. "It run to 103 chapters. When they got married the book stopped right off, so I reckon their troubles were all over. It's real nice that that's the way in books anyhow, isn't it, even if 'tisn't so anywhere else?" "I never read novels," said Miss Cornelia. "Did you hear how Geordie Russell was today, Captain Jim?" "Yes, I called in on my way home to see him. He's getting around all right, but stewing in a broth of trouble as usual, poor man. Course he brews up most of it for himself, but I reckon that don't make it any easier to bear." "He's an awful pessimist." "Well, no, he ain't a pessimist exactly, Cornelia. He only just never finds anything that suits him." "And isn't that a pessimist?" "No, no. A pessimist is one who never expects to find anything to suit him. Geordie ain't got that far yet." "You'd find something good to say of the devil himself, Jim Boyd." "Well, you've heard the story of the old lady who said he was persevering. But no, Cornelia, I've nothing good to say of the devil." "Do you believe in him at all?" asked Miss Cornelia seriously. "How can you ask that when you know what a good Presbyterian I am, Cornelia? How could a Presbyterian get along without a devil?" "Do you?" persisted Miss Cornelia. Captain Jim suddenly became grave. "I believe in what I heard a minister once call a mighty and malignant and intelligent power of evil working in the universe," he said solemnly. "I do that, Cornelia. You can call it the devil, or the principle of evil, or the old scratch, or any name you like. It's there, and all the infidels and heretics in the world can't argue it away, any more'n they can argue God away. It's there, and it's working. But mind you, Cornelia, I believe it's going to get the worst of it in the long run." "I'm sure I hope so," said Miss Cornelia, none too hopefully. "But speaking of the devil, I am positive that Billy Booth is possessed by him now. Have you heard of Billy's latest performance?" "No, what was that?" "He's gone and burned up his wife's new brown broadcloth suit that she paid $25 for in Charlottetown, because he declares the men looked too admiring at her when she wore it to church the first time. Wasn't that like a man?" "Mistress Booth is mighty pretty, and brown's her color," said Captain Jim reflectively. "Is that any good reason why he should poke her new suit into the kitchen stove? Billy Booth is a jealous fool, and he makes his wife's life miserable. She's cried all the week about her suit. Oh, Anne, I wish I could write like you, believe me. Wouldn't I score some of the men around here?" "Those Booths are all a mite queer," said Captain Jim. "Billy seemed the sanest of the lot till he got married, and then this queer jealous streak cropped out in him. His brother Daniel, now, was always odd. Took tantrums every few days or so and wouldn't get out of bed," said Miss Cornelia with a relish. "His wife would have to do all the barn work till he got over his spell. When he died people wrote her letters of condolence. If I'd written anything it would have been one of congratulation. Their father, old Abram Booth, was a disgusting old sot. He was drunk at his wife's funeral and kept reeling round and hiccuping, 'I didn't drink much, but I feel awfully queer.' I gave him a good jab in the back with my umbrella when he came near me, and it sobered him up until they got the casket out of the house. Young Johnny Booth was to have been married yesterday, but he couldn't be because he's gone and got the mumps. Wasn't that like a man? How could he help getting the mumps, poor fellow? I'd poor fellow him, believe me, if I was Kate Stearns. I don't know how he could help getting the mumps, but I do know the wedding supper was all prepared, and everything will be spoiled before he's well again. Such a waste. He should have had the mumps when he was a boy. Come, Cornelia, don't you think you're a mite unreasonable?" Miss Cornelia disdained to reply, and turned instead to Susan Baker, a grim-faced, kind-hearted elderly spinster of the Glen, who had been installed as a maid-of-all-work at the little house for some weeks. Susan had been up to the Glen to make a sick call, and had just returned. "How is poor old Aunt Mandy tonight?" asked Miss Cornelia. Susan sighed. Very poorly, Cornelia. I'm afraid she will soon be in heaven, poor thing." "Oh, surely it's not so bad as that," exclaimed Miss Cornelia sympathetically. Captain Jim and Gilbert looked at each other. Then they suddenly rose and went out. "There are times," said Captain Jim between spasms, "when it would be a sin not to laugh. Them two excellent women." End of chapter 18. Chapter 19. Dawn and Dusk. In early June, when the sand hills were a great glory of pink wild roses, and the Glen was smothered in apple blossoms, Marilla arrived at the little house, accompanied by a black horsehair trunk patterned with brass nails, which had reposed undisturbed in the Green Gables garret for half a century. Susan Baker, who during her few weeks' sojourn in the little house had come to worship young Mrs. Doctor, as she called Anne, with blind fervor, looked rather jealously askance at Marilla at first. But as Marilla did not try to interfere in kitchen matters, and showed no desire to interrupt Susan's ministrations to young Mrs. Doctor, the good handmaiden became reconciled to her presence, and told her cronies at the Glen that Miss Cuthbert was a fine old lady and knew her place. One evening, when the sky's limpid bowl was filled with a red glory, and the robins were thrilling the golden twilight with jubilant hymns to the stars of evening, there was a sudden commotion in the little house of dreams. Telephone messages were sent up to the Glen. Dr. Dave and a white-capped nurse came hastily down. Marilla paced the garden walks between the quahog shells, murmuring prayers between her set lips, and Susan sat in the kitchen with cotton wool in her ears and her apron over her head. Leslie, looking out from the house up the brook, saw that every window of the little house was alight, and did not sleep that night. The June night was short, but it seemed an eternity to those who waited and watched. "Oh, will it never end?" said Marilla. Then she saw how grave the nurse and Dr. Dave looked, and she dared ask no more questions. Suppose Anne— But Marilla could not suppose it. "Do not tell me," said Susan fiercely, answering the anguish in Marilla's eyes, "that God could be so cruel as to take that darling lamb for us when we all love her so much." "He has taken others as well, beloved," said Marilla hoarsely. But at dawn, when the rising sun rent apart the mists hanging over the sandbar and made rainbows of them, joy came to the little house. Anne was safe, and a wee white lady with her mother's big eyes was lying beside her. Gilbert, his face gray and haggard from his night's agony, came down to tell Marilla and Susan. "Thank God," shuddered Marilla. Susan got up and took the cotton wool out of her ears. "Now for breakfast," she said briskly. "I am of the opinion that we will all be glad of a bite and sup. You tell young Mrs. Doctor not to worry about a single thing. Susan is at the helm. You tell her just to think of her baby." Gilbert smiled rather sadly as he went away. Anne, her pale face blanched with its baptism of pain, her eyes aglow with the holy passion of motherhood, did not need to be told to think of her baby. She thought of nothing else. For a few hours she tasted of happiness so rare and exquisite that she wondered if the angels in heaven did not envy her. "Little Joyce," she murmured when Marilla came in to see the baby. "We planned to call her that if she were a girlie. There were so many we would have liked to name her for, we couldn't choose between them, so we decided on Joyce. We can call her Joy for short. Joy. It suits so well. Oh, Marilla, I thought I was happy before. Now I know that I just dreamed a pleasant dream of happiness. This is the reality." "You mustn't talk, Anne. Wait till you're stronger," said Marilla warningly. "You know how hard it is for me not to talk," smiled Anne. At first she was too weak and too happy to notice that Gilbert and the nurse looked grave and Marilla sorrowful. Then, as subtly and coldly and remorselessly as a sea fog stealing landward, fear crept into her heart. Why was not Gilbert gladder? Why would he not talk about the baby? Why would they not let her have it with her after that first heavenly, happy hour? Was there anything wrong? "Gilbert," whispered Anne imploringly, "the baby is all right, isn't she? Tell me. Tell me." Gilbert was a long while in turning round. Then he bent over Anne and looked in her eyes. Marilla, listening fearfully outside the door, heard a pitiful, heartbroken moan and fled to the kitchen where Susan was weeping. "Oh, the poor lamb, the poor lamb! How can she bear it, Miss Cuthbert? I am afraid it will kill her. She has been that built up and happy, longing for that baby and planning for it. Cannot anything be done nohow, Miss Cuthbert?" "I'm afraid not, Susan. Gilbert says there is no hope. He knew from the first the little thing couldn't live." "And it is such a sweet baby," sobbed Susan. "I never saw one so white. They're mostly red or yellow. And it opened its big eyes as if it was months old. The little thing. Oh, the poor young Mrs. Doctor." At sunset the little soul that had come with the dawning went away, leaving heartbreak behind it. Miss Cornelia took the wee white lady from the kindly but stranger hands of the nurse and dressed the tiny waxen form in the beautiful dress Leslie had made for it. Leslie had asked her to do that. Then she took it back and laid it beside the poor, broken, tear-blinded little mother. "The Lord has given and the Lord has taken away, dearie," she said through her own tears. "Blessed be the name of the Lord." Then she went away, leaving Anne and Gilbert alone together with their dead. The next day the small white joy was laid in a velvet casket which Leslie had lined with apple blossoms and taken to the graveyard of the church across the harbor. Miss Cornelia and Marilla put all the little love-made garments away, together with the ruffled basket which had been befrilled and belaced for dimpled limbs and downy head. Little Joy was never to sleep there. She had found a colder, narrower bed. "This has been an awful disappointment to me," sighed Miss Cornelia. "I've looked forward to this baby, and I did want it to be a girl, too." "I can only be thankful that Anne's life was spared," said Marilla with a shiver, recalling those hours of darkness when the girl she loved was passing through the valley of the shadow. "Poor, poor lamb, her heart is broken," said Susan. "I envy Anne," said Leslie suddenly and fiercely. "And I'd envy her even if she had died. She was a mother for one beautiful day. I'd gladly give my life for that." "I wouldn't talk like that, Leslie, dearie," said Miss Cornelia deprecatingly. She was afraid that the dignified Miss Cuthbert would think Leslie quite terrible. Anne's convalescence was long and made bitter for her by many things. The bloom and sunshine of the Four Winds world grated harshly on her. And yet, when the rain fell heavily, she pictured it beating so mercilessly down on that little grave across the harbor. And when the wind blew around the eaves, she heard sad voices in it that she had never heard before. Kindly callers heard her, too, with the well-meant platitudes with which they strove to cover the nakedness of bereavement. A letter from Phil Blake was an added sting. Phil had heard of the baby's birth, but not of its death, and she wrote Anne a congratulatory letter of sweet mirth which hurt her horribly. "I would have laughed over it so happily if I had my baby," she sobbed to Marilla. "But when I haven't it just seems like wanton cruelty, though I know Phil wouldn't hurt me for the world. Oh, Marilla, I don't see how I can ever be happy again. Everything will hurt me all the rest of my life." "Time will help you," said Marilla, who was racked with sympathy but could never learn to express it in other than age-worn formulas. "It doesn't seem fair," said Anne rebelliously. "Babies are born and live where they are not wanted, where they will be neglected, where they will have no chance. I would have loved my baby so, and cared for it so tenderly, and tried to give her every chance for good, and yet I wasn't allowed to keep her." "It was God's will, Anne," said Marilla, helpless before the riddle of the universe, the why of undeserved pain. "And little Joy is better off." "I can't believe that," cried Anne bitterly. Then, seeing that Marilla looked shocked, she added passionately, "Why should she be born at all? Why should anyone be born at all if she's better off dead? I don't believe it is better for a child to die at birth than to live its life out, and love and be loved, and enjoy and suffer and do its work, and develop a character that would give it a personality in eternity. And how do you know that it was God's will? Perhaps it was just a thwarting of his purpose by the power of evil. We can't be expected to be resigned to that." "Oh, Anne, don't talk so," said Marilla, genuinely alarmed lest Anne were drifting into deep and dangerous waters. "We can't understand, but we must have faith. We must believe that all is for the best. I know you find it hard to think so just now, but try to be brave, for Gilbert's sake. He's so worried about you. You aren't getting strong as fast as you should." "Oh, I know I've been very selfish," sighed Anne. "I love Gilbert more than ever, and I want to live for his sake. But it seems as if part of me was buried over there in that little harbor graveyard, and it hurts so much that I'm afraid of life." "It won't hurt so much always, Anne." "The thought that it may stop hurting sometimes hurts me worse than all else, Marilla." "Yes, I know. I've felt that too about other things. But we all love you, Anne. Captain Jim has been up every day to ask for you, and Mrs. Moore haunts the place, and Miss Bryant spends most of her time, I think, cooking up nice things for you. Susan doesn't like it very well. She thinks she can cook as well as Miss Bryant. Dear Susan. Oh, everybody has been so dear and good and lovely to me, Marilla. I'm not ungrateful. And perhaps, when this horrible ache grows a little less, I'll find that I can go on living." End of Chapter 19. Chapter 20. Lost Margaret. Anne found that she could go on living. The day came when she even smiled again over one of Miss Cornelia's speeches. But there was something in the smile that had never been in Anne's smile before, and would never be absent from it again. On the first day she was able to go for a drive, Gilbert took her down to Four Winds Point and left her there while he rode over the channel to see a patient at the fishing village. A rollicking wind was scudding across the harbor and the dunes, whipping the water into whitecaps and washing the sandshore with long lines of silvery breakers. "I'm real proud to see you here again, Mistress Blythe," said Captain Jim. Sit down, sit down. I'm afeard it's mighty dusty here today, but there's no need of looking at dust when you can look at such scenery, is there?" "I don't mind the dust," said Anne, "but Gilbert says I must keep in the open air. I think I'll go and sit on the rocks down there." "Would you like company, or would you rather be alone?" "If by company you mean yours, I'd much rather have it than be alone," said Anne, smiling. Then she sighed. She had never before minded being alone. Now she dreaded it. When she was alone now she felt so dreadfully alone. "Here's a nice little spot where the wind can't get at you," said Captain Jim when they reached the rocks. "I often sit here. It's a great place to just sit and dream." "Oh, dreams," sighed Anne. "I can't dream now, Captain Jim. I'm done with dreams." "Oh, no, you're not, Mistress Blythe. Oh, no, you're not," said Captain Jim meditatively. "I know how you feel just now, but if you keep on living, you'll get glad again, and the first thing you know you'll be dreaming again. Thank the good Lord for it. If it wasn't for our dreams, they might as well bury us. How'd we stand living if it wasn't for our dream of immortality? And that's a dream that's bound to come true, Mistress Blythe. You'll see your little Joyce again some day." "But she won't be my baby," said Anne with trembling lips. "Oh, she may be, as Longfellow says, a fair maiden clothed with celestial grace, but she'll be a stranger to me." "God will manage better than that, I believe," said Captain Jim. They were both silent for a little while. Then Captain Jim said very softly, "Mistress Blythe, may I tell you about lost Margaret?" "Of course," said Anne gently. She did not know who lost Margaret was, but she felt that she was going to hear the romance of Captain Jim's life. "I've often wanted to tell you about her," Captain Jim went on. "Do you know why, Mistress Blythe? It's because I want somebody to remember and think of her sometimes after I'm gone. I can't bear that her name should be forgotten by all living souls, and now nobody remembers lost Margaret but me." Then Captain Jim told the story. An old, forgotten story, for it was over 50 years since Margaret had fallen asleep one day in her father's dory and drifted, or so it was supposed, for nothing was ever certainly known as to her fate, out to the channel beyond the bar, to perish in the black thunder-squall which had come up so suddenly that long-ago summer afternoon. But to Captain Jim those 50 years were but as yesterday when it is past. "I walked the shore for months after that," he said sadly, "looking to find her dear, sweet little body, but the sea never give her back to me. But I'll find her sometime, Mistress Blythe. I'll find her sometime. She's waiting for me. I wish I could tell you just how she looked, but I can't. I've seen a fine silvery mist hanging over the bar at sunrise that seemed like her, and then again I've seen a white birch in the woods back yonder that made me think of her. She had pale brown hair and a little white sweet face and long slender fingers like yours, Mistress Blythe, only browner, for she was a shore girl. Sometimes I wake up in the night and hear the sea calling to me in the old way, and it seems as if lost Margaret called in it. And when there's a storm and the waves are sobbing and moaning, I hear her lamenting among them. And when they laugh on a gay day, it's her laugh, lost Margaret's sweet, roguish little laugh. The sea took her from me, but some day I'll find her, Mistress Blythe. It can't keep us apart forever." "I am glad you've told me about her," said Anne. "I've often wondered why you had lived all your life alone." "I couldn't ever care for anyone else. Lost Margaret took my heart with her, out there," said the old lover, who had been faithful for 50 years to his drowned sweetheart. "You won't mind if I talk a good deal about her, will you, Mistress Blythe? It's a pleasure to me, for all the pain went out of her memory years ago and just left its blessing. I know you'll never forget her, Mistress Blythe, and if the years, as I hope, bring other little folks to your home, I want you to promise me that you'll tell them the story of lost Margaret, so that her name won't be forgotten among mankind." End of chapter 20.